Welcome to CISO Chair, where true cyber leadership, real stories, and industry insights take center stage. This is your seat at the table.
Hello, I'm your host Ashish, and welcome back to CISO Chair, where we explore the true essence of leadership in cybersecurity beyond titles and technical jargons. Before we dive into today's conversation, let's set the scene. In September 2024, a cyber attack targeted the water treatment facility of Arkansas City, Kansas, temporarily disrupting operations and forcing to switch to manual controls. This incident, like several others in recent years, highlights just how vulnerable our operational technology systems are and how breach in these critical environments can impact public safety and services. Today, we dive deep into often overlooked cybersecurity of operational technology and industrial control systems, the complex network powering utilities, factories, transport, and more. Nobody understands these intricacies better than our today's guest from Greenville, South Carolina, United States, Mr. Mike Holcomb. So, Mike is the fellow of cybersecurity and global ICS OT at Fluor, a leading engineering plant. Beyond his role, he is a community catalyst educator, building platforms like BSides ICS OT to help others master this vital field. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate it. No, I appreciate you reaching out and for the invite.
Great, so good to have you here. So, to quickly kick things off, the world of ICS and OT can feel like a hidden domain to many cybersecurity pros, but behind every expert is a story. Can you share the moment or your journey that led you into this specialized world?
Sure. Yeah. When I first got interested in OT or ICS is when news of Stuxnet had come out. So this was in 2010, where the Americans and the Israelis had created malware to get into a Iranian facility where they were enriching uranium to become material for making nuclear bombs. And I was really fascinated with the story. I think there's a spy component there, right? So that was always very fascinating. They talked about how they used 4 Windows 0-day vulnerabilities in the attack. So I was like, okay, well, I was coming from the IT cyber world, so I thought that was really, really interesting. But where I was really fascinated with was how they talked about that the malware would take control over the physical systems in the real world. These controllers from Siemens that were responsible for these centrifuges. So it would control moving the centrifuge, right? Spinning them to enrich this uranium gas. And that it would slowly break them down over time using physics, which I was just absolutely, again, fascinated with. And then it even got more fascinating because when I found out is, well, if you were an operator in the control room at that Natanz facility in Iran, that if you were looking at all the boards and all the pretty lights, that you would see that everything behind the scene was perfectly fine. So you're sitting in the control room, everything is perfectly fine, at least you think so. But behind the scenes, those centrifuges are slowly breaking down over time. And so I was just really fascinated, coming from an IT cybersecurity background, which is what I've always done, is how we start to be able to reach out into the real world and have an impact. And that's where I was hooked.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And many listeners know cybersecurity through an IT lens. How do you explain what truly makes OT security different and demanding?
Yeah, there's definitely differences. I think it's probably because I come from an IT cybersecurity background, and I don't like when OT folks, either try to keep IT people at arm's length or say you don't know what you're talking about. We all need to work together. So when we look at the differences between IT and OT, I do like to focus on there's more similarities between the two, but where they are different, I think where OT can come across as being mysterious. And I know it was for me in the beginning. It was in the OT world. Like if I have a power plant, that my number one consideration is making sure that everybody that works at that power plant stays safe. Right? I want to make sure that the environment in which that plant resides is safe. So our number one priority is safety. That's not something that you normally take into consideration in the IT or the IT cyber world. And once we get past safety, most people will focus on operational availability, right? If I have a power plant, not only does that power plant exist to generate electricity to power homes and businesses, right, the world around us, but it's also how that company gets paid, right? It's how they generate revenue. So a lot of times maybe that's the first consideration that people focus on, but really we need to make sure safety first. So we keep our people safe, keep the environment safe, and then we can focus on operational availability. So part of cybersecurity is making sure we keep the attackers out so everything stays up and running. Whether it's a power plant, you mentioned water earlier, right? We want to make sure we have clean water in our homes and offices and hospitals and so on. So yeah, I think those are some of the big differences between the two. So it's a different mindset from that perspective.
And does that different mindset also come with a sense of elevated responsibility because the outcomes and results of something going bad are little more than tangible?
For sure. I think that's why a lot of people work in OT cyber because they believe in that mission, and that's nothing against anybody that still works in like IT cyber today. Again, I came from an IT cyber background of 20 plus years, I think 35 at this point. It's we all have an important role to play, but if you think in an IT environment that if the entire company gets infected with ransomware and the company goes down, it takes a couple days, maybe up to 10 days to bring the company back up and running. And usually the company, right, will slowly get back to work. And in OT, right, it's if we have an attack, that's where we do talk about not only people could die, people could get hurt, there could be damage to the environment. What happens when that plant goes down? Sure, not only does that company start losing money, but what if it was a power company, right? And all of a sudden now we're not producing power for 10,000 people and maybe for an hour. Okay, that's not a big deal. But what if it's 2 or 3 days or becomes 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months? Then you start to understand what those real repercussions are to the world around us. So it's not just about the company, but it's about the community that company or that plant serves.
And is there any surprising misconception that you could share with us about OT security that outsiders often have?
I think probably the biggest just one is I think most people this is what I used to think was that it was very complicated, it was very complex, right? And it's not actually at the end of the day. So it's a big part of why I focus on sharing content on LinkedIn and YouTube and teaching courses, because if I can learn this, anybody can learn it. And you can learn to defend these environments, and you can learn to defend these environments against the most advanced state adversaries even. It's actually much easier to protect OT than it is a lot of IT environments. Doesn't mean, it's super simple, right? But it is easier than IT in a lot of respects. So yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complex. Again, if anybody wants to learn it, then they can, for sure.
And would it be correct if I say there is a lot of technology when we talk about factories or power plants or in the railways, like in your current experience? And what I was trying to get to is how do you secure systems built decades ago without risking downtime with legacy tech?
Yeah, a lot of OT environments have older equipment, right? If that power plant is 30 years old, then yeah, it was built 30 years ago. So all the equipment for the most part inside of it is probably 30 years old. And so how do you defend that? So in a lot of those environments, that's where we talk about defense in depth. Which is interesting in the OT world, because in IT and IT cybersecurity, everybody's very familiar, and that's a concept that we all agree to, right? And that we just continue to add security controls, additional layers, because we realize if one layer fails and we only have one control, then the attackers will get in. And so we continue to layer controls upon layers of controls. In the OT world, a lot of engineering folks, the folks in OT themselves, they almost see it as a bad concept or a bad term. And I still don't necessarily understand 100% why, because I think it's totally makes sense, right? If I only do one thing for security and that's the attacker bypasses that, then the attacker wins. So why wouldn't we want to continue to apply security controls as time and resources permit? So it's really interesting. It really comes down to we can master the basic fundamentals and wrap those basic controls around the plant. So things like network segmentation, making sure we have backup and recovery, right? So these are those things that everybody from an IT cybersecurity background should be familiar with. And then you can look at, well, how does this apply in the OT world? Very similarly. There are definitely some areas that are very different, like vulnerability management. But for the majority, I say that IT and OT security are more similar than they're not.
And let's talk about what's holding industries back. Despite the stakes, what are the biggest obstacles, in your opinion, that are preventing companies from embracing OT cybersecurity fully?
Yeah, I think there's two big issues that we face. One is a lack of awareness and education. The OT world is still very much like IT was 10, 15 years ago. So 10, 15 years ago, sure, there were some businesses, the larger businesses, the banks, right? They had, even at the time, top tier cybersecurity programs. But the vast majority of companies in the IT world, right, they were doing very little to nothing about cybersecurity. And that's very much where we're at today. Now, things have changed, especially since the Colonial Pipeline breach back in 2021. That's where most owners and operators in OT and industrial environments realize we actually have to do something about cybersecurity in OT. At least it's on their radar. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing something about it today. The other problem, besides a lack of awareness and education, which again, that's been getting better over the last few years, but people don't realize the majority of OT environments, they don't have the resources to do much about cybersecurity, unfortunately. In my day job, I work with some of the largest companies in the world, right? The Shells, the BPs, the Saudi Aramcos, that they invest heavily, right? And have some of the more mature OT, ICS cybersecurity programs in the world. And that's great. That's awesome. And at the same time, when you look at it, the majority of the environments out there, I always think of, especially I'm from the Carolinas, we have manufacturing everywhere. So yeah, there's only 5 or 6 power plants, within the state. We have, I could reach out and probably touch 5 or 6 manufacturing plants from my doorstep. And unfortunately, the vast majority of like those manufacturing facilities, they'll never have the budget. They'll never have the people, never have the resources to truly secure their environments against attackers. And so that's why a big focus again of my education, my content, LinkedIn and YouTube is around here's the basics to start with that you should be doing regardless, and that they're not going to cost you as much. I'm not telling you, right, to spend $100,000 to bring somebody in to do a penetration test. Let's start with making sure your backups and recoveries are really dialed in, right? So when you do get compromised, you can restore services as quickly as possible. Because just like in the IT world, it's not a question of if you're going to get compromised. It's only a question of when. And so start with those low cost things that all of these environments can build off of over time and start to secure their environment. And then hopefully they have additional resources over time. I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
So, is it safe to infer that the intent is there, but maybe because of not enough talent, maybe because of budgetary reasons, and maybe because of certain business decisions, it does not get the attention that it deserves, both in short and the longer term?
Yeah, I mean, and those all come into play, right? There's not a lot of folks out there that truly understand how to secure OT or ICS environments. That's a big part of why I do what I do, content-wise. With that said, there's not a lot of roles out there either. OT actually also pays less than IT. So if somebody had a choice, they probably would actually do something like IT cyber over OT cyber, right? If it comes down to a question of money. We mentioned, the lack of awareness and education even at the leadership level. So a lot of the owners of the environments, again, they maybe before a couple of years ago didn't realize they had to do anything about cybersecurity for their OT environment because they considered them untouchable or unhackable. And now we see that's very different. But again, a lot of these environments they don't have those resources. If you have let's say a small water company that provides water to, I think of South Carolina, to a couple small neighborhoods and a trailer park, they will never have the resources to do anything about OT cybersecurity. They'll never have an OT cybersecurity person. They don't have an IT cybersecurity person today. They probably don't even have an IT person today. If they have an IT issue, they call somebody, right, that comes in on a temporary basis and hope they know what they're talking about and what they're doing. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of challenges, right? There are the companies that have the money to do what they need to, but the majority don't have the resources, and they never will unless something changes. And then there's there are some medium-sized and growing companies that, as they get larger, right, they're improving their programs. They are starting to look at, okay, investing in OT cybersecurity, which is great. And I do site consulting, so I work with the smaller and the medium-sized companies as well. And so it's great to see some of them being able to grow their programs. I have probably the most fun in helping organizations grow their OT cybersecurity programs. But again, the people forget that the majority of the environments out there, they're just never going to have those resources unless at the end of the day there's regulation and government steps in.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned about that. And on the regulatory front, in your opinion, are compliances and standards evolving fast enough to deal with today's OT threats, or is there a dangerous flag there?
Yeah, being based in the United States, yeah, we have mentioned, with power, and we have NERC regulations, which covers power generation and transmission in North America. And so that was a positive step in the right direction. I would say, especially in power, though, it is a good minimum. It's a minimum bar, right? These are the things you should be doing at a minimum. Is it improving and maturing as quickly as it should? No. No, they actually just included a requirement for network security monitoring last year. That should have been done a long time ago, right? Because if we're not monitoring the environment, how would we even know there's an attacker in the environment? That's when when Volt Typhoon was announced. We were finding Chinese adversaries in all these power environments. Nobody knew they were there because they weren't looking. We weren't doing network security monitoring. So when you think of something like ensuring power, right, and how that leads to things like national security, right, and impacts us in our daily lives, because we need power for everything, to put food on the table, to get clean water out of the tap. Without power, right, civilization breaks down. So in the United States, we have very little regulation, and NERC, it's making positive steps. It's slow. And I think in most countries you see little regulation, but what little is there, it's kind of that bare minimum. It's like, okay, here's where you start. But any company that's serious about OT and ensuring, and again, take the security question out of the equation realistically, to just say, I want to make sure my plant stays up and running. Well, do you want your plant to come down because of a cyber attack or a ransomware attack? Well, no, of course not. Well, then let's look at how we can protect it from an OT cybersecurity perspective, but how that affects or increases your availability, right? Your uptime, because that's really what it's about. And so that's the big focus, and companies are starting to make that shift, where how can we get resources over to OT to help, yes, increase security, but really it's about increasing availability.
And I have a little bit of a tongue in cheek kind of a question. Is it true that the industry still waits for a catastrophe before acting or taking OT security a little more seriously? Will it take lives, or are we that
Yeah,
close?
unfortunately, I think the IT world is like that too, just from the perspective that it took breaches like the Target breach that happened. Before the Target breach happened in the U.S., at least U.S. companies, right, businesses, didn't do anything about IT cybersecurity. In 2021, when we had the Colonial Pipeline breach, that was the target breach for the OT world, right? That actually got a lot of OT organizations realizing, hey, we needed to do something about it. Unfortunately, it also let the attackers know, hey, there's this thing out there called OT and ICS, and I can attack it, and I can make make money. There are some of the, I could talk about, like the old school OT cybersecurity people said, they might tell me like, oh, you're running around and you're trying to spread fear and uncertainty and doubt because nobody has died or nobody, the impact is very small. And for me, I'm the opposite. Again, coming from the IT cybersecurity world, I remember when the impacts were small, when companies would get hacked and it's like, oh, they were only down for a couple of hours and they got back up and running. Today we're seeing different attacks, like you mentioned water earlier, where we have, one of the more popular, I think, stories is the Cyber Avengers hacktivist group that's aligned with Iranian interests. They were impacting a lot of water treatment facilities. Now, all of those water treatment facilities, like the one you mentioned earlier, they fell back to manual operations. So citizens, right, out in the real world, right, they never saw an interruption in water delivery, right? But there was a water treatment facility in Ireland where 160 people lost water for 2 days, right? Or we just saw the Russians not about a year ago with an attack called Frosty Goop, which is a horrible name, but the idea is that the Russians had turned off heating for 600 apartment buildings, not 600 apartments, but 600 apartment buildings in Ukraine in the middle of winter with sub-zero temperatures outside. And so we are seeing those impacts. Now, I know like the total American thing is, well, that's on the other side of the planet. That doesn't impact me. I'm like, yeah, but that attack that you see in the Ukraine right today, that could be in the US tomorrow or in 10 years or more than likely somewhere in between. So we are seeing impacts. I'm the person that I like to focus on the facts. I'm not trying to spread fear. I'm just saying this is what has happened. We see the increases in the attacks. We see the increase in the impacts, which only shows, if we chart that out, that there's more coming down the road. And unfortunately, as Rob Lee and Mike Asante would say, that we're not ready. We're not ready for what's coming. So my goal is to help people, right, get ready, right, and through awareness and education and helping people build out their OT cyber program.
I would certainly want to get into the specifics of how you are helping and your contribution in this space. But before that, with cyber attacks often crossing national borders, how well do you think currently geopolitical risks factor into OT cybersecurity planning globally?
Yeah, no, that's great questions because I used to be the person, being IT cyber and doing a lot of incident response and a lot of defense and going up against like state adversaries to hacktivists and everybody in between, that I always wanted to take geopolitical considerations out of the equation, right? Because realistically, and I still take the approach that at the end of the day, I don't care who you are or where you're coming from. I don't care if it's Russia or China or the United States. Right? I just want you off the network and I want you gone. Right. But I think at the same time, we do have to be aware of that part of the conversation. And especially today, we see the increase in attack between, especially Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Iran. Right, those are probably the two biggest OT cyber hotspots that we see today. And it's absolutely trying to look at it from a removed perspective. It's fascinating to see not only the attacks like from Russia into the Ukraine by groups like Sandworm, which is the most probably I think popular, the most OT cyber security attacker group out there, most prolific, at least known in the kind of the real world. And then at the same time, now there's a large contingent of hacktivist groups that have come to support Ukraine and how they're going after Russia. So I find it absolutely fascinating from that perspective. So we do have to take those conversations into consideration, and even more so, right, if you're a Ukrainian citizen or you are a Russian citizen or if you're an Iranian or an Israeli, right, you are going to more than likely be impacted than somebody in Canada or India, right? It's just there's that raised level of threat because of those what's going on in the real world and those geopolitical considerations. But again, at the end of the day, I don't care who you are, right? I just want you off the network and make sure you don't come back.
And looking ahead, what emerging trends or technologies do you think will most transform ICS and OT security in next 5 to 10 years? And the second question also is, what is the impact of AI in this space?
Yeah, I mean, AI is actually, definitely the first one that comes to mind when you talk about what's changing, what's coming up. Just like in any in any field, in every aspect of our lives, I'm a big proponent for AI. It's just learning on where can we use it, right? In the U.S., I think a lot of the effective work is being done to how can you use AI to help effectively run the grid, right? As far as like looking at weather data and understanding if you had a really cloudy day, how does that impact solar generation, right? Throughout the daylight hours, and how do we adjust, right? Things like that, that a human operator, multiple human operators have to do today, where we could use AI to offload that and allow those human operators to focus on other things that could be more important. So I think that's great. I think we see that continue to grow. And eventually we will get to the point where, and this is where, of course, cringe is, and hopefully that's long in the future, but where you have AI just running plants, right? And you have robots running around taking care of things like maintenance. And a lot of these environments are very dangerous. We don't want humans in a petrochemical facility, or think a nuclear power plant, or even a traditional power plant, right? We don't want to put people in harm's way if we don't have to. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves over, definitely the next 5 to 10 years. So I think otherwise, it really goes back to kind of what we were talking a little bit earlier, is really there's just so many environments today that are doing very little to nothing for OT cybersecurity. And again, a lot of it comes down to awareness and education. So it's about getting more of the awareness and education out there. Hopefully, right, it doesn't take like big incident at like say a petrochemical facility blowing up and killing people before people start taking OT cybersecurity seriously. So hopefully we try to keep getting as much awareness and education out there and helping people understand this doesn't have to be any more complicated than IT cybersecurity. And this is how you can build your program in a very straightforward, simple, cost-effective, and not super expensive manner that anybody can follow.
From global corporate leadership to grassroots community building, you have founded BSides ICS, OT, and other initiatives. I'm curious to know what inspired you to invest in these communities.
Yeah, I think a big part when I do my community work, a big focus for me is just connecting people with jobs in cybersecurity, and whether that was originally in IT and now in OT cyber. Because I know for me that when I was growing up, I came from, my family didn't have a lot of money. And my dad, who was always sick, he didn't work a lot, and it just, of course, that caused a lot of issues. And thankfully, my grandparents, if it wasn't for my grandparents, there would definitely be times where we missed meals. But I never, I can't complain, right? I never missed a meal, and I was very loved, so I don't have anything to complain about. But I also realize like just how people and families struggle, and then when I got into IT and IT cyber and started actually making really good money, how it changed my life, and how that can change the life for other people's families. That's why I always had that focus on community in the IT world, and wanted to connect people with learning about IT cybersecurity and just being able to provide better for their families. And then that just kind of extended into OT, and really the same thing, except for me at court, then there's this much bigger mission of, hey, it's great that I can connect people with jobs, but at the same time, right, while they're getting those jobs and they're taking care of their family and making a better life for themselves, wow, they're also making a better life for everybody else, because they are protecting power plants and water treatment facilities and transportation and manufacturing, right? All the services that we rely on in our daily lives. And so, yeah, that's really about, it's about, bringing people into the field, help them connect with those jobs, or help them realize it's not for them. And they, hey, go find what is for you, right? Don't be here, don't do OT cybersecurity if it's going to make you miserable, right? But for the people that do find it, right, and they connect with it and they believe in that mission, and then they help protect our communities, right? It doesn't matter where in the world you live, right? We all want to make sure our families and our friends and our community are safe, and we have power and clean water and right, et cetera, at the end of the day. So that's really a big part of why kind of how BSides Greenville locally came about, and I ran the ISSA chapter, which is IT cybersecurity, for almost 20 years here, and then I started BSides ICS this year and had a really great event, and we'll be back in Miami next year in February. So I'm really excited, and we have a couple of events around the world also coming up in next year's in Belgium and Singapore, and there's talk about India and Mexico and a couple other places. So that's really exciting because again, it really brings us people in, helps them move into OT cyber, because we need people that can do the job and believe in the mission to protect our families and our communities at the end of the day.
That's awesome, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the entire community for carrying the baton and showing light to a lot of people. Talking about that, for engineers and cybersecurity pros looking to transition into OT, what mindset shifts or skills would you say are essential?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, of course, I come from the IT cybersecurity world, but I also work for one of the world's largest engineering companies. There's like 10 companies in the world that do what we do. And so I work with, not directly necessarily with all of them, but we have 4,000 just electrical and control system engineers. And so I work with a lot of engineers, is what I'm trying to say, right? And so over the years, I've been there for over 14 years. It wasn't long before I got to step foot on my first power plant. That was back in like 2012, and having those conversations. I've been having those conversations, and I've been helping train, our engineers on cybersecurity since then. And so I've been able to get a good idea of kind of what somebody from the OT or engineering world need. And so I was really fascinated. Like for me, I used to think engineers know everything, right? And they're very super, super smart, very brilliant, right? But a lot of them don't understand the basics of IT networking, right? They might have a concept of Ethernet, but they couldn't, tell you the difference between a public and a private IP address, let alone how to assign an IP address or how TCP/IP works. And in today's world, you need to understand, right? Because if you go to a power plant that's being built today, it's all TCP/IP. Yeah, that plant we were mentioning that's 30 years old, that if you went into that plant, no, there's not TCP/IP anywhere, and there's not Ethernet, right? Everything's hardwired. And so that what made that environment much more secure, where today everything is interconnected, right? Just like our homes are on the internet. Now we have power plants, right, on the internet in some way, shape, or form, right? For better or for worse, right? We have all these OT environments connected with IT environments. So engineers have to take the time to understand, the basics of networking. And then they also have to learn the basics of just cybersecurity in general. And then after you mastered those, then you can look at how do we take these and we apply them to the OT world? Because the engineers understand the physics of the plant and the different control systems, and how, well, if I have this power plant, right, how we have these control systems that essentially monitor and control how this turbine spins to then spin a generator to create electricity. Well, we have to make sure that that turbine just on its own, it doesn't spin too fast, or it doesn't spin too slow, or what if it starts to overheat? Right? Those are things that can just happen naturally over time. Then we can start talking about, well, what if we introduced an attacker into the mix? What if there was somebody sitting on the network, and then they could cause the turbine to spin too fast, or too slow, right? Or to make it shift basically almost like on and off really quickly, really fast over a short amount of time, to break down that turbine to where it doesn't work, right? And then you can't just go pick one up at the local store. You have to order one, and it comes in about 18. So that's those conversations we want to have, is For folks coming from OT or control systems like engineers, right? It's let's learn the basics of IT networking. Let's learn the basics of cybersecurity, and then look at how we apply them into our OT environments and have those conversations of, what would happen if there was an attacker sitting, on your network in this one place? And then you start over and say, well, what if they're sitting over here? And what if they're sitting over this? Right? And what are they sitting on this part of the network? What could they do? I've learned so much over the years because I get to work with some of the best engineers in the world having those conversations. Like, what would happen if an attacker was sitting right here? And then they start to, they enjoy it, like getting to put on their evil hat and starting to think of what an attacker could do if somebody really, had that intention. And that really goes to the last point is engineers have to realize that people have those intentions, because like most owners and operators, they don't think, nobody's going to do that to us. Nobody wants what we have. They don't want it in our network. We don't have anything that they want. Right? They're not going to come into our power plant and cause a blackout. They would never do that. Why? Like, well, your power plant, well, it supplies power to, right, these homes and these businesses, and also this military base. Like, forgot about that. And so your adversary might look at, we want to take that power plant offline because it'll actually knock that military base offline and put them on their reserve power. They're not thinking about what the impact would be to the public civilian population, unfortunately. So just those types of scenarios. But yeah, we need to learn IT networking, cybersecurity basics, how to apply those to OT, and be able to put on the evil thinking hat and then, perform those risk assessments and look at, if I had an attacker in this part of the environment, what could they do? And then, they could do some really bad stuff. Well, okay, how do we protect against that? And it's a big part of OT cybersecurity, is doing those risk assessments, asking those questions, and then how do we protect against it?
And there is so much in common as well, in terms like you mentioned about transitioning from cybersecurity to OT security. There is so much learning that you have taken. But that also brings me to an ironic question, that even though with all these similarities, the ICT and OT practitioners and IT security experts still some way and in some sense appear to be too siloed. And what is your opinion on that? And what do you think can bridge that divide?
Yeah, that could be a 40-hour conversation. I'll try it. As you can tell, I talk a lot. I'll try to keep it as short as I can. But I think there's a couple things. It's to really, truly be an OT cybersecurity professional, you have to understand the OT, the control systems world, like from an engineering perspective. You don't have to be an engineer, but you have to learn. I almost think of, you have to be at least a junior engineer, right? That's a big part of what I'm working on, because I come from the IT cybersecurity world. And if you're coming from the OT world, so let's say you're an engineer, well, then you need to learn, again, IT networking, cybersecurity fundamentals, and how that applies in OT. So to really be a true OT cybersecurity professional, you have to be able to do both. The part of the problem is really, right, to be able to do each of those, right, really well, you need at least a minimum of 5 to 10 years. Right? You need a minimum of 5 to 10 years on the IT side. You need a minimum of 5 to 10 years on the OT side. So let's say it takes 20 years to get somebody up and running in OT cybersecurity. By the time they're really good at their job, it's time for them to retire. And unfortunately, I think that's what we have to realize today, is there are very few people out there, and there will be very few people still in a couple of years, that really truly understand OT cyber. Like I am trying my best, right, to learn, again, as much about engineering as possible. But so because of that situation, we have to understand IT and OT have to work together. And I've seen environments where they work really well together, and it's a beautiful thing. And they're the most secure environments because of that relationship. And I've seen environments, and some large environments, and this is some in my outside consulting, and I, in fact, had somebody reach out over LinkedIn, runs one of the biggest OT environments in the United States, and was talking about that they had all of these failures in their program. It was just kind of mind blowing that this would happen in this, in one environment. It all came down to just a breakdown between IT and OT, and I mean, just people having common decency, even just to work with each other, to have a conversation. I mean, it was really mind-blowing how bad it was, because they just, and it wasn't that they were fighting, they just weren't talking to each other, because I think if they were talking, they were fighting. And so it's much more this human psychological condition that has to be overcome, right? You need a therapist on staff rather than kind of maybe a deputy CISO to cover OT. You really need a therapist to get IT and OT to work together. Because that's, if we're not working together, the attackers are going to win. It's as simple as that.
Before we close, we'll quickly move on to the signature rapid fire round. I just wanted to hear from you on one life or leadership lesson in cybersecurity you wish more people understood.
Yeah, I think a big one is not being the person that says no. I learned that one back in when Wi-Fi came out. And I worked for this guy named Dan Crow. He's an old U.S. Army guy, like gruff, hard hitter, but very practical, straightforward. Really appreciated and learned a lot from him. And when Wi-Fi came out, right, I was the person like, we can't have that in the company, right, because it's unsecure and we're going to get hacked. And he's like, you can say that, they're going to do it anyways. So instead of saying no, let's say, okay, well, let's implement Wi-Fi, but let's help you do it as securely as possible. And that's also very true in not only the IT world still today, but like with things like cloud, right? When cloud first came out, right? That's a very typical, or what about AI today, right? They're going to do it regardless. And the same thing is in OT, right? You can say no, and there's a few cases, right, where you have to stand your ground and say no, there's way too much risk. But the vast majority of the time, it's the business is going to do it anyways. So you might as well say, okay, let's do this, but let me help you make it as secure as possible. And that's all you can do. But yeah, I think that's the one that's helped me, I think, tremendously in my career. And I think it's actually made for a lot of more secure environments rather than having the business implement something or have shadow IT or shadow OT come in and make changes and introduce vulnerabilities and risk.
Thank you so much again for all your inputs. Now, before we wrap up, just wanted to hear from you. If there's someone interested to know more about OT, how can one reach out to you? How and where can one sign up to your newsletters? And how can one be part of, in whatever way you're helping the community today?
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. You can find me on LinkedIn is the one place I always am. So if you just look for Mike Holcomb on LinkedIn, you can also go to mikeholcomb.com and it'll have links to the newsletter. It'll have links to my YouTube channel and you can search for me at those places as well. But yeah, either mikeholcomb.com or on LinkedIn. Those are the best places to go.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, stories, and insights. This conversation sheds light on the unseen but vital frontiers of cybersecurity in industrial and operational technology. And to our listeners, whatever your role or geography, securing the future of critical infrastructure depends on these conversations and leadership like Mike's. From the CISO chair to wherever you are, thank you for being part of this journey to listen, learn, lead, and grow together. And thank you, sir, once again for taking out time and enlightening us with all your wisdom.
Thanks, Ashish. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody for listening.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for joining CISO Chair. Subscribe for global perspectives and bold conversations on cybersecurity. Stay secure, stay inspired. See you in the next episode.